everyone. Welcome. It's 7 o'clock. We'll get started. It looks like we have a lot of people joining us, so we're ready to kick off our evening here. Welcome. There's Rebecca. Hello. My name is Amanda Gillen. I'm the Director of Learning at the Frick Pittsburgh. Welcome to Murderous Millinery, which is probably the best program title that we've ever had. And we're really excited to share some really wonderful content with you tonight. With me on screen are Don Brean, the Associate Curator of Decorative Arts at the Frick Pittsburgh, and our very special guest, Rebecca Kelly, who is textile conservator at the University of Rhode Island and visiting curator at the Newport Historical Society. Don will do a better, more complete introduction of Rebecca in just a minute. I'm here just to do a little welcome and get us all started. This is the second program in a series of 3 programs about birds that we've been doing this spring online at the Frick. The first program was a panel discussion about bird migration and safety, and that happened at the end of February. I know a lot of you who are on here tonight were with us for that program, so thank you for joining us again. Our third program is an author talk happening in April, and I'll share some more information about that at the end of this program tonight. I am recording the program, and you have probably noticed that we have some captions going across the bottom of your screen. If you don't want to have the captions on, well, you can do a couple of things. If you bring your cursor toward the bottom of the screen, you'll see a little block toward the right with this double C, and it says live transcript. There's a little arrow there, and if you click on that, you have some options to hide the subtitle, view the full transcript, or I think under subtitle settings, you can actually make text larger if you need that. And in fact, well, I won't do it now because it will mess up the entire webinar. I was going to make it larger, but I think you can do that for yourself if you need that. Don and Rebecca are going to take it from here. I just want to say a couple more things. One is that they will happily answer questions tonight. We can't see you or hear you, but you're welcome to put your questions in either the chat or the Q&A function, which is they're both at the bottom of your screen. They'll try to answer some as they go along, but we might also do those at the end, depending on how our conversation goes tonight. The last thing I wanted to say is thank you to our Frick members. We have a lot of you with us tonight. We always do. We are always grateful for your support and grateful for you showing up in person and online, excuse me, to spend some time with us. I know there is a lot of digital content out there, so we're grateful that you choose us, that you choose to spend an hour with us. And I think you are actually in store for a really wonderful hour. So with that, I will turn it over to Dawn to welcome us and to introduce Rebecca. Thank you, Dawn.
Thank you, Amanda, and thank you everyone for being here. It's my pleasure to welcome Rebecca Kelly back to Pittsburgh, at least virtually. She's been a great friend to the Frick over the last few years, and I'm so excited to have her with us for tonight. I spent the most fun professional week at work, I think in my entire career, when Rebecca visited Pittsburgh a few years ago, and we spent 5 glorious days in storage looking at the Frick costume collection. Rebecca is a textile and dress historian with a background in textile conservation, and she's worked for the Preservation Society of Newport County, as well as the Museum at the Fashion Institute of Technology. And like Amanda mentioned, she's currently serving as textile conservator at the University of Rhode Island, teaching at RISD, and serving as a visiting curator at the Newport Historical Society, where she's working on a fabulous show about the Vanderbilt fashion collection. So it's my pleasure to welcome our esteemed guest, and I'm really excited to dive into a really fascinating topic. Rebecca has put together a fabulous presentation, so I'll let her pull that up now.
Yes, thanks so much for that introduction, Dawn. It is just so great to be virtually back in Pittsburgh. And I often dream of that summer that we spent in collection storage as well. It was just magical. It was like Christmas morning in summertime because I was there in the summer and we just got to unbox so many fantastic things.
So Amanda shared a little information about the series of bird programs that we're doing, and this is really the second in a trio. And we've had a lot of fun looking at birds, and nature is one of the most enduring inspirations for artists and designers and makers of all kinds, and particularly birds. Their colorful plumage and their symbolic qualities have really captivated makers and consumers alike. So this slide here that Rebecca is showing is just a selection of the decorative arts objects that you can find at Clayton that have birds or feathers or avian related motifs on them. Particularly in the 19th century, birds found their way onto a lot of objects. There was a focus, with the spread of industrialization and with people migrating to urban centers and cities, there was this desire to bring nature into the home. So these objects functioned a lot like the landscape paintings that were bought and collected by Henry Clay Frick, and kind of bringing nature into the domestic setting. And the Frick family seems to be big fans of birds. In particular, Helen Clay Frick had pet canaries in her playroom on the 3rd floor. The library collection at Clayton is filled with books on identifying birds, and her brother Childs was more inclined in the natural history direction, but our focus tonight is going to be on fashion. So I think give a little bit of background. In the 19th century, this interest in feathers and bird-inspired adornment explodes into a multi-million-dollar industry that led to the almost entirely unregulated slaughter of birds all around the world. And it brought a lot of species to the brink of extinction at the turn of the century. And it's alternately dubbed the plume boom or murderous millinery, depending on what side you were on, by the press. And this period is really going to be the focus of our conversation tonight. But I want to ask Rebecca to share a little bit about where her interest in bird-related motifs comes from as well.
Great. Thanks so much, Dawn. Yeah, I think from many different places. I mean, when I look to textile history, and I just love the assortment of objects that you pulled together from Clayton, it is so amazing. What a popular motif it was, design inspiration in the 19th century. One of the classes that I most often teach is a textile history survey. And over the years, I must really wax poetic about William Morris, because at the end of the semester, so often I get the most adorable, cards or some kind of little William Morris inspired gifts. And my students have reflected that, wow, you're just so passionate about this textile. William Morris is very famous, the Strawberry Thief. And I think I love this textile because, the birds look so kind of charming, and you're seeing that personality. We have a little catbird that hangs out in our yard every summer, and, he is always stealing the berries just the very morning that you were thinking about perhaps going out there and picking it. And I think that that's something that William Morris really has brought to his work, kind of the liveliness of birds. So I grew up in a family, my mother and grandmother were avid gardeners, so I really relate to this textile and kind of the observation of birds and nature in that way. So I think as a textile conservator, when then I started going into collections and dealing with 19th century hats, it was really shocking as a young conservator to find, almost entire birds on top of hats and wings and all of these things.
So maybe that's a great place to start. Is this interest in birds extends, far back. It's not a new thing, but where does the interest in feathers on hats and in fashion really start to become apparent, and who's participating in the trend?
Yeah, that's a great question, and something that kind of comes up often with my textile history students and my apparel design students. We talk a lot about, how do we even define fashion? What is fashion? And, I really think it's tough. Feathers are organic, so they don't really survive in the archaeological record for us to know for sure. But just what we know about prehistory, tattooing, practices of tattooing, people finding shells and beads and using sinew to string them together and make ornamentations for the body. So, I just very much suppose that there's no way if people came across stray feathers that they wouldn't pick them up and add them to their ornamentation. Even myself, if I am walking on the beach and see a blue jay feather, it's just like, oh, and I just go right to it. I can absolutely not resist picking it up. So I think there's a really long history of that. And, there are some particular landmark moments if we sort of shift over and thinking about, Western fashion, the emergence of the real sort of fashion system that we know today being very much linked with the Renaissance. And scholars point a lot to the year 1521. It was the year that Hernan Cortez started shipping feathers and things that he came across in the Americas back to the court of Charles V in Spain. This is one such object that is in a museum collection in Austria, one of these extraordinary feathered headdresses from Central America. And the feathers that you see here, does my little pointer work, Dawn? Can you see it on the screen? Just
Yes,
moved the whole slide, but okay, great. And the shimmery changeable feathers that you see there are from this magnificent bird, which is native to Central America, the quetzal. And, he looks really charming here. When you see them in flight, he's just absolutely resplendent. And, scholars make the point, though, he only has 2 of these extraordinary tail feathers. So you start thinking about how many of these birds went into the making of these headdresses. In the Aztec culture, feather makers did occupy really revered places in the culture. Feathers were really a valued part of ceremonial dress. So, they started all sorts of objects from the Americas, from South America, as well as Central America. Again, started making their way, to Europe and becoming part of, collections, cabinets of curiosity, probably. They circulated at the court of Charles V and caused absolute sensation. Everybody wanted to know about them. And I think people found them incredibly inspired. Imagery, the visual culture of what people in the Americas looked like captivated people's imaginations, I think, for sure. And then slowly but surely in Renaissance portraiture, you start to see feathers. The feather trade, they weren't really coming from the Americas yet, but there were already feathers circulating in Western Europe, especially the ostrich plume. And the ostrich plumes were probably coming from Africa, traded into Europe through trade with the Ottoman Empire. And ostrich plumes have a really long history and association of symbolism with truth and valor. But again, something that starts out kind of innocently really starts to get somewhat over the top when we start looking at some of this portraiture. And again, I just wanted to maybe point out one more example, and I promise we'll leave the Renaissance behind. But I wanted to share with everyone this really incredible manuscript from the year 1521. And the man that you see on the screen is named Matthias Schwartz. And he was not a nobleman, he was an accountant, a quite successful one. And he actually was invited to this festival day where he was going to have an opportunity to meet Ferdinand of Austria, Charles V's brother. And he was really a clothes horse. And he actually commissioned this manuscript. It's now available. You can buy a facsimile copy of it. It was in a German museum collection really for years, but it just got a lot of notoriety quite a few years ago. The BBC did a story about it, and people have really become very obsessed with it. I talk a lot with my students. He really was the first fashion blogger, the first Instagrammer or selfie taker. He commissioned this artist to capture his clothing, and he was a real clothes horse. And fascinatingly, scholars in Great Britain have made a reproduction of this costume because everyone's just like so intrigued. So it has at least 36 ostrich plumes, people think. He picked the colors red and white because those were the heraldic colors of Ferdinand, and he really wanted to get his attention at this festival day. So reenactors have worn this reproduction of this costume, and I have some sources at the end of the presentation if anyone's interested. I'll make sure that Amanda is able to share them with everyone, because to see this reenactor move in this costume is absolutely spectacular. And I think that that is the attraction of feathers, whether it's a culture that's using them as part of ritual and ceremony. It's very much a performative, look at me, look at me. And Matthias Schwartz made an absolute spectacle of himself, very intentionally, we think, at this event in 1521. And, you know, it panned out for him. Ferdinand eventually made him an aristocrat. So interesting to think about, right? And then I guess I couldn't close out this section just without mentioning Louis XIV, the Sun King, here adorned in feathers as well. And again, it's a really interesting time period. France very much wants to get into the feather game, to get into the fashion game. And it's a lot about the advent of the luxury trades. But I see a couple of questions.
Don't see anything in the Q&A. Maybe I'm missing something in the chat. We'll definitely stop you.
I don't see any questions yet. I just made a note that we will happily send out any links or resources that you want to share with everybody after the webinar is over. But I don't see any questions yet, Rebecca. If you do, I'm missing them. I'm sorry.
Okay, great. Maybe something just flashed on my screen. I thought it was a little question module, but no worries. We'll catch up.
As if the red and white leggings of Matthias Schwartz were not eye-catching enough, like to add all of the, the ostrich plumes in as well. I mean, this is very striking ensemble. So it seems pretty clear that the plume boom, the moniker might have started in the 19th century, but by no means was the interest in feathers begun in the 19th century. So before we move into the 19th century, we have to visit one of the periods where feathers are in really high fashion. And there's a period like the Gilded Age, notorious for excess and materialism, maybe my second favorite time period of the Rococo and the 18th century. And there's one figure in particular that I think a lot of us associate with feathers in the 18th century. Can you tell us what role feathers really played in fashions of the Rococo and the Ancien Regime?
Yeah, absolutely. I think that that's, again, just another time period, you know, kind of moving on from the Sun King to the reign of Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette. I really think of this time period as the one where fashion does really step across that threshold from the old fashioned to the modern. You know, you're just kind of like moving forward in time. Concepts about retailing and all of these things are starting to change. And a lot of you are probably familiar with this very famous portrait of Marie Antoinette en chemise wearing this white cotton gown. And, you know, it caused such a sensation at the 1783 Salon that it had to be taken down. And it was replaced with this portrait that you see on the right-hand side of the screen. So the dress changed from cotton to silk, but the feathers stayed. So I think that that's really interesting to think about. And, you know, it really becomes a time period when a lot of the fashion trades, things that Louis XIV had set in motion. You know, he really wanted France to be a center of luxury production. He lured Italian lace makers to come and settle in parts of France. He made sure that the silk weaving studios of Lyon had everything that they needed to become kind of the most fashionable, the trendsetters, the epicenter of fashion, you know, and everything from embroidery houses to feather makers, silk flower workshops really become very integral to the French economy during this time period. I also actually think of it as the very roots of fast fashion are probably buried somewhere in this time period. You know, when we talk about or think about women, even at the upper echelons of society, the very highest ranking women of the French court, were still pre-sewing machine. You know, fabrics were regarded as really expensive. So it was a big undertaking to commission a new dress. So, what people had to think about was a whole group of fashion items that are really called novelties in the period. I've spent a lot of time looking at 18th, and the word continues into the 19th and even early 20th century of novelties. And that was little things that were ready made. So you could kind of have that instant gratification that maybe online shopping fulfills for a lot of us today, by starting to visit some of these shops that were in and around, you know, the same areas of France that are the center of the haute couture industry today, the Rue Saint-Honoré, the Palais Royal, all of these places. Women, like the woman you see on the screen, Rose Bertin, had shops. And they actually are sort of a whole new class of merchant. And they're called the marchands de mode, the sellers of fashion. And they're really selling trimmings. They're selling flowers, they're selling ribbons, they're selling feathers, and they're arranging things into these really captivating little hats, little things for your hair. And actually, the headdresses, some of them were even just called poufs, and they were just a little poof of muslin or some of these other really beautiful sheer fabrics that then they would be custom trimmed out for you. And they sometimes even recorded like contemporary events, like when a hot air balloon went up in Paris, suddenly everyone's headdress maybe had feathers and flowers and a little ascending balloon as part of it. So this certainly is, you know, phase one of the plume bloom. And just another really lovely image. You know, it is this whole time period where shopping is starting to become this leisure activity, conspicuous consumption. You're going out finely dressed to look at all the new novelties and accoutrements of the period. And again, it's also the first time that we start to see some satirical cartoons. The popular press was very powerful in the 18th century. And, you know, here we're seeing women really sort of being blamed, I think, in some ways for this fascination with the feathered headdress. And I wanted to take a little bit of the attention off of them and put some of the gentlemen on the hot seat here as well. Because if we look to England for a minute, so across the channel there was a whole subculture of young men who were nicknamed the macaronis. For the most part, the macaronis were young aristocratic men who had gone on the grand tour. So they'd gone to Italy, they'd gone to France, they had seen the fashions on the continent, and they brought some of these ideas home with them. And again, if you think about the traditional British country gentleman versus the more flamboyant fashions, perhaps of France and Italy, these guys made a little bit of a sensation when they got home, and they were really famous for wearing feathers, having extreme hairstyles, wearing bright colors. And of course, we have the song here, Yankee Doodle Dandy stuck a feather in his cap and called it macaroni. And that is the reference for that song, you know, is these young aristocratic proto dandies, really, of the 18th century in England.
So I've always kind of thought of the marchand de mode as like the precursor to the stylist as opposed to a fashion designer. Do you think that's a fair characterization of that kind of trade?
I do. That's a really great question. And yeah, I agree 100%. You know, they weren't seamstresses, they weren't dressmakers. They were really dealing with the stuffs of fashion. And again, it was just that idea, you know, fashion is driven by change and novelty. And, you know, it took a while to make a dress in the 18th century, but these are the things that could be instantaneous, and that instant gratification of going to the shop and being able to walk out with something, and that really changed, you know, the fashion system.
Mhm.
So
So the fashion industry definitely changes after the French Revolution. And I think this taste for excess materialism, ornamentation goes out of fashion, but not for very long. And feathers come back with a vengeance in the late 19th century. So can you tell us a little bit about how the marchand de mode profession and how it transitioned into the 19th century and what kind of trade popped up in its place?
Sure. Yeah, I think that's a great question. Yeah, and I think I pulled together some images, and these lovely fashion plates are from the University of Rhode Island's collection, and they're just so charming to look at. And, you know, the simplicity of the Empire and Directoire periods in France, you know, really influenced by the neoclassical, you know, and I almost think it was like that Control-Alt-Delete moment, like fashion reset, you know, and everything had gotten so extreme, it kind of goes back to zero. So here we see some pretty innocent looking feathers just on a little bonnet, and, you know, a feathered headdress on the right hand side of the screen as well. And, you know, I really love Jane Austen's novels. They really capture this time period. And, you know, there's always that going into town to buy some trimmings and some new things to redo a hat. And, you know, it was just such an important part of culture. And, you know, things may remain pretty steady through the middle part of the 19th century as well. If we kind of think of the years of the American Civil War, not a lot of feathers. You know, bonnets were worn really close to the face, like in this wonderful daguerreotype. And you really see the rise of popularity for like these little silk flowers, and lace was a really fashionable way to trim a bonnet during this period. I also love this period because it is the advent finally of photography. So we're starting to get, you know, a better understanding of how people at different social and economic levels engaged with these aspects of fashion. So I find that really fascinating. And then I guess, you know, there's also this really interesting aspect of, you know, again, things that started with the marchand de mode in the 18th century, just propelling even forward. You know, the city of France itself is changing, the haussmanization of the city, the building of all of these grand boulevards and these wonderful little arcades, you know, for this new culture of consumption is really fascinating. And I think the millinery trade is so well captured in Degas' work. I think he's perhaps more famous for the ballerinas in some cases, but once you start looking at how many paintings he did of the milliner's shop, it's really fascinating. And there's a really lovely online exhibition that's in one of my links at the end if anybody is kind of curious to know more. It's a really interesting kind of look, and you feel like you get to almost walk in to some of these shops, and it's quite fascinating. You know, Degas himself was considered a bit of a dandy, so he was just really fascinated with this new urban lifestyle, shopping, bit of a flâneur, if you will, kind of strolling the streets of Paris and just absorbing this new culture of consumption. And again, it was, you know, so unique. It was a new way of interacting, whole societal shifts sort of going on during this time period. And I think that coming up next, yeah, I have a couple of more photographs kind of looking into the world of the workers a little bit. Just thinking about all of that. And I think, yeah, the inside of another really incredible hat shop. This one's right in my hometown of Newport, Rhode Island. This photograph was taken around 1912. And again, you know, very much like walking into a Degas painting, these really beautiful salons where the women would go and try the hats on. And the sellers of the hats would, you know, help you pick good colors, pick good flowers, and pick something that was very flattering to you personally. And I think I have in here, Dawn, I was going to maybe kick it over to you for a second to maybe talk a little bit more specifically about some of the hats in the Frick collection.
Yes, for sure. So you can see in this photograph of Helen Clay Frick and her mother Adelaide Howard Giles Frick from 1905, they're both wearing these huge expanse of hats. I think, you know, some of the hats in this period of the early 20th century could extend to like 3 feet wide, and they're really like a canvas for these trimmings, for feathers. And like you mentioned in the beginning of the presentation, you know, it's not just the feathers that are being used. I think even from the 18th century, as, you know, extravagant as Marie Antoinette was supposed to be, you know, it's really one extravagant feather, or it's a few. But in the 19th century, women are decorating their hats with full carcasses of birds, like full species of birds are showing up on hats. And we have a few examples here. The hat on the left with the blue ostrich feather plume is actually a young girl's hat. It was a milliner in Paris who made hats specifically for young children. So this would have been worn by Helen or her sister Martha in the 1890s. And then the hat on the right is a Parisian New York milliner who had locations in both cities, but you can see there where the bird is being used. And I think we actually sent this particular hat to a contact that we had, trying to see if we could trace the specific type of bird, and I think it was a raven, and they weren't quite sure. But I think you can tell even just by the way that this hat is displayed, you know, the feathers are off at these really dramatic angles, which are not quite how a bird would have been seen in flight or in nature at any given time. So it starts to give you a little bit of a hint as to how the feathers and these parts are being used, and it's really grisly. I don't, you know, we won't go into too much detail here, but it's really, really grisly. Thank you. One of our docents just told me it was narrowed down to a crow, an American crow or a fish crow, not a raven. Thank you, Melanie. So you can see that parts are being used, and I'm not sure if the next slide shows some of the trimmings that we have in the collection. I was really astounded in preparation for this talk, was starting to look through some of our boxes in storage, and I found this photograph actually before I found them in storage, where you can just see a bird head being used, and the head has been sewn onto this kind of understructure that then would have been pinned to your hat with some of these other little beaded ornaments that would have been like tucked into your hat with a hat pin. And then the kind of oval shapes on the sides are feathers, just individual kind of wings that would have been shaped. So really, really kind of grisly when you think about how these animals are being used. There's the slaughter involved in the number of feathers that needed to be collected for a certain type or style. And I have a couple of statistics here that we pulled from contemporary sources, because it's just fascinating to hear these numbers. And I should say that while Paris and New York were really kind of the hat manufacturing centers, it's really London was the center of the international feather market. And this was an incredibly lucrative business. This is a multi-million-dollar industry, highly valuable, very sought after. And while some birds like ostriches were farmed and considered a kind of sustainable choice because they were plucked once a year, there was this rumor that, you know, some birds, you know, it was fine because they only collected the feathers that were shed. And then looking at contemporary sources, that is simply not the case. Most species were really hunted to the brink of extinction, which included the egret, the great egret, and the heron. And often birds were hunted during nesting season, which was kind of even more heartbreaking, because if you're hunting these birds, you then are leaving eggs or fledglings in the nest who aren't taken care of, and then expire as well. So these reports on these atrocities were really widespread in the press, right around the turn of the 20th century. So some of the numbers at the international market, there was one order from one London feather dealer in 1892 included 6,000 birds of paradise, 40,000 hummingbirds, and 360,000 feathers from various East Indian birds. I mean, those are astonishing numbers that are really being thrown about. And then I have to read this quote in its entirety. William Hornaday was one of the early conservationists and activists. He wrote the Vanishing Species. I'm probably getting that title wrong, but in 1913, he told the New York Times that the blood of uncounted millions of slaughtered birds is upon the heads of women. They have shown themselves a scourge to bird life all over the world. The vanity of women and their thoughtless, stupid devotion to style that in this instance is decreed solely by commercial interests, are wiping off the face of the earth one after another of our beautiful and interesting bird species. The hummingbirds of Brazil, the egrets of all of the world, the rare birds of paradise, the toucan, the eagle, the condor, the emu, all are being exterminated that women may decorate their hats. This quote is just simply scathing. I mean, he's out, he's out there. And it's not an uncommon stance that was taken by a lot of conservationists. And I feel like it's such an unfair, kind of unfair laying of the blame at the feet of women, because rarely were the very male, often mostly male hunters, male hat manufacturing factory owners, and feather marketers, rarely were they targeted in their criticism against the bird trade and the feather trade. And it's really women who were behind a lot of the early progressive conservation efforts. So I'll turn it back over to Rebecca to tell about one wonderful pair of women who were behind the formation of one of the Audubon societies.
Thanks so much, Dawn. And I was almost going to switch to this slide while you were talking, but I just held off because I wanted to give everyone a little bit of a warning. It is one of the ones that is particularly, heart-wrenching. And I think it's like what the newspaper quote that you were reading was kind of speaking to. This is a pair of earrings made of hummingbirds in the Metropolitan Museum of Art's collection that date until around about 1865. So again, I think it's this, just decimation, absolute decimation of bird populations, and women really starting to react to some of what they are reading about in the press. And, the trickle down theory of fashion is very powerful. And, Dawn working with the hats worn by Adelaide and Helen, and myself working a lot with collections worn by women of the Vanderbilt family, it's really interesting sometimes to be over working with the collection at the University of Rhode Island, because it's a collection that really is the clothing of everyday people. And there's just an enormous amount of hats in that collection as well that have feathers. And also in the photography collection there, which primarily documents the type of dress that women were wearing in, small town Rhode Island at the beginning of the 19th century. And this is one of my absolute favorites here. Her jacket is showing these like enormously fashionable sleeves of 1895, and she's bedecked in the plumes and the feathered boa. So, it was really interesting to think about, how women start to address this issue, and really starting to consider, are these fashions appropriate? What are we doing to our natural environment. And again, I think that this satirical cartoon also really brings to the forefront some of the things that you were mentioning. And I will point out that at least down here, the cartoonist has made the retrievers have these faces, these masculine faces, and he has labeled them as the French milliners. And I was like, okay, at least these businessmen are being acknowledged in that way. And some scholars talk often about this cartoon, and people speculate that, you know, this perhaps represents Coco Chanel, who began her career as a milliner and then became, of course, one of the most famous couturiers of all time. But interestingly, Chanel was a huge proponent of down with these crazy hats. You know, she very famously said, how can you even think with something like that on your head? And she was really the one that pushed women's fashion to these simpler, more streamlined fashions of the 1920s. Lots of scholars who think about this time period, you know, do think about the hats sort of fading out of fashion with the transition to women wanting to participate more in the new modern world around them. Although when I think about the lifestyle of the 1920s, maybe the hats were smaller. You certainly still see feathers, you see feathered hair ornaments, and you definitely see feathered boas and all of these things associated with the dance crazes of the time period. So again, I think that two of the first women in the United States to really take the bull by the horns, if you will, and be like, it's time for women to stand up are Harriet Hemingway and her cousin Mina Hall. And they were both Bostonians, Boston socialites, who read, I think, you know, various news stories, especially about the egrets in Florida and what was happening with the marsh birds down there. And they basically just got out the social index and started writing letters and started gathering women together, tea parties and other small social events, and just started to advocate for, you know, the power of the consumer. If we just don't buy these, if we can change the market demand for them, it'll make a huge difference. And, you know, they started really advocating for various legislation that was passed. You know, in America, it was the Lacey Act that was passed in 1900, followed by the Migratory Bird Act that prevented the killing and selling of migratory birds. And, you know, that finally happened in 1918. They had really started their movement around 1896. So, you know, it took a long time to get the legislation, but their grassroots operation, from, you know, what I have read in the press, was incredibly effective. And a lot of women did stop and think. And, you know, Queen Alexandra in England was even said to have, you know, stopped wearing feathers on all of her hats. And British legislation, you know, somewhat preceded American legislation in some ways. As early as 1867, there were starting to be books on the laws on the books rather, about birds in England. But, you know, their colonial empire was vast, and it in no way stopped the importation of exotic birds. So that's kind of interesting to think about for sure. Let's see. And again, Mina Hall and Harriet Hemingway really became the founders of the Massachusetts Audubon Society. And they sort of talk a lot about the power of John James Audubon's illustrations. You know, his Birds of America was, you know, widely circulating and had enormous popularity in both England and America. You know, it incorporates over 335 images of birds, and people really respond to the ability that he had to sort of, again, I think very William Morris-esque. It's about the observation of the birds in nature. And I think it was really interesting, Dawn, when you were talking about the hat, the crow hat, it's so collaged together and sort of disconcerting because it's not a real bird. So I think, it allows you to be kind of dismissive of it almost, and you sort of lose perspective. And Audubon's work is very much credited with giving people perspective, and that it was really important to conserve habitat and to conserve these species, as so many of them were disappearing. Did you have
a point? Yeah, because in our early conversations, you equated in some ways, the hunting of birds for feathers to not unlike the ivory industry today, and thinking how, often elephants are slaughtered and then their carcasses are left to rot, and the ivory is stolen and created into decorative objects. And there's a lot of parallels to what was happening with the birds in the 19th century. And then it's also worth mentioning that there are a lot of parallel efforts at the same time in the late 19th century. Birds were not the only species or animals that, were the targets of the fashion industry or industries in general. I mean, there's also whales, which were being used for corsets and the structural undergarments for women, otters, seals, buffalo, a lot of animals, a lot of preservation efforts were aimed with really similar motivations behind them.
Yeah, absolutely. And, this comes up a lot with my students when we start talking about ideas of sustainability and the fur industry. And people, again, I think people were always a little bit more dismissive about feathers, and now people are really starting to, question the efficacy of feathers as well. And, it is really interesting, and I have complex feelings about it too. I used to be like, oh, vintage fur, but my students have kind of swayed me the other way. I'm like, yeah, no, you can't do it. So it's so interesting to think about. And I was lucky a few years ago, the Preservation Society here in Newport put on a really wonderful exhibition of Audubon's plates. So to see them beautifully framed and, just how magnificent they are was interesting. And they did address a lot of conservation issues, in trying to save wildlife and bird habitat. And they borrowed some objects from the University of Rhode Island's collection. The fans that you see here are beautifully mounted by my colleague, Susie Jerome. And like you, we had, did some research. There's an ostrich plume fan here, turkey feathers. These are dyed from the lyrebird, and they're just these incredible tail feathers. And this is some kind of game bird. We kind of got stumped on this one, like you guys with the raven crow. So it's just, interesting to, think about this time period in history and how philosophies and ideas ebb and flow and change.
That's kind of the perfect segue into our final section, which is really what is the future of feathers in fashion. I think as much as the taste died down with World War I and the interest in smaller hats, or you still don't see feathers disappear completely, and feathers are still part of fashion today. So how are contemporary designers kind of addressing those sustainability concerns?
Yeah, it's really, that's a great question. And, I think kind of going back to the Aztec Empire or Matthias Schwartz, this idea of feathers and performance, I just don't know that it's ever going to completely disappear from culture. I think there's something so inherent to the human condition about ornamenting ourselves. And I think, we even have the expression in fashion, peacocking, and it's actually really often associated with male dandyism, like in the macaroni. But, there is this propensity to want to wear these things because they are so spectacular. And, you know, I think, again, we're imitating the same way that birds might use their plumage in the wild. It's like, look at me, these like Planet Earth documentaries, again, with these like wonderful birds of paradise and how they use their plumage in these ways. And I think it's really interesting if you think about the Moulin Rouge. And one of the links that's in my little resources at the end is just, you know, performances, burlesque, Moulin Rouge, you know, feathers are so much a part of it. And one of the last surviving feather makers in France is a house called Maison Février, and they are the ones that now fully are responsible for taking care of the Moulin Rouge costumes. And it's one part conservation. They're trying to make the costumes they have last as long as possible. So a lot about the caretaking of these feathers. And that's another thing I see often when researching, was that in the 19th century, women did that. You would recycle your feathers, get them re-dyed, get them fluffed up. So that's interesting to think about as well. And then, you know, a lot of my students, my apparel design students who are grappling with these issues because they want to use these beautiful textures, you know, everything from fur to feathers, they have long histories, and, you know, trying to think about cruelty-free feathers. And once you start researching all of this, you kind of can go down these rabbit holes. And, you know, there needs to be, I think, a lot of transparency in the industry, like, what does cruelty-free mean? Where do these feathers come from? What's happening? You know, some things are a byproduct of the food industry. So, you know, it's interesting to think about. And then a lot of designers are experimenting with all sorts of kind of forward-thinking ideas. And many of you probably know the work of Iris van Herpen, Dutch-based designer who has been fascinated by the idea of biomimicry. And can you kind of essentially lab make out of silicone or other materials things that mimic feathers? You know, and Iris, sort of like going back to that William Morris idea, you know, is fascinated with birds in flight, you know, and she's someone who has spent a lot of time observing birds in nature. And I think that this is one of her most spectacular collections from 2018. And these dresses are incorporating a whole lot of both synthetic and natural fibers. She was using silk organza and some mylars and polyesters to laser cut these dresses. And I was dying to put some videos into this presentation, but I was just like, ooh, I could be setting myself up for disaster. So again, a lot of the videos are linked with some of my sources, but to watch the runway models move in these dresses, they are like living beings. They almost become like birds. And Iris van Herpen very famously, a couple of years ago, made this short film, a collaboration with the Dutch National Ballet and dancer Jing Mao here, wears a couple of different costumes in this 4-minute film. It's absolutely mesmerizing. There's certain aspects of it where it is like a modern interpretation of Swan Lake, and she looks like a swan, you know, and it's because of the costumes. And there's no feathers, but they give you this sensation of feathers. And I think this is maybe one of my last images, but again, just another, like, you know, she was so fascinated by the skeletal structure of feathers. And I think throughout time and history, you know, people are like, why can birds fly and we can't? You know, I think that's another reason. I think why so many cultures venerate birds and are just, you know, fascinated by them. And I think that it's just, yeah, something that's very inherent to us as humans.
Such a fabulous costume to land on. I think she's a really exciting designer. We'd love to open this up for question and answers. So a few of you have put some questions into our Q&A. We're happy to take anything you put into the chat. And I'll ask a couple of these just because they cover some topics that we didn't quite get to. So this is a great question. That one thing that we didn't really get into was the embalming chemicals exposed to millinery workers and the toxins the toxic atmosphere that they had to work in, which is absolutely true. I think so many of these, the process for prepping a feather to be used on a hat is so tedious and involved tons of chemicals. It would go through a cleaning process, a bleaching process, and then dyeing. And the dyeing could be one of the most tedious parts because each different part of the feather would absorb the dye at slightly different rates. So you had to have someone who was really knowledgeable with that practice. There were also ways, I think it's called willowing, where they would use short strands of feathers and kind of tie them together to achieve this much longer feather than would have been found in nature. So yes, absolutely an industry like so many of the industries in the 19th century where you found yourself in an incredibly, unsafe, toxic work environment. A lot of young children and women were employed in the feather sweatshops of New York's Lower East Side. So I'm really glad that person made that comment in our Q&A because it's an important facet of this industry for sure. Rebecca, do you have more to share about the types of people what kinds of people were working in the factories or what conditions they worked in?
Yeah, it's such a great question, and it's something the current exhibition that I'm working on right now, we really have been trying to tell the behind the scenes story. So like you, I've just been tirelessly looking for the lost histories, the people who aren't represented in the photographs and the portraiture, and the people who got to really enjoy the fashions, and who were these people kind of searching for a better future and the upward mobility that maybe work in the fashion industry perhaps offered. But yeah, there were a lot of pitfalls. And I can definitely recommend a book by a scholar named Allison Matthews David. And the book is called Fashion Victims. And she has really done a lot of that research, just looking at everything from like census records to factory records, and really acknowledging just how precarious 19th century life and culture was, and there just not being any kind of social net or regard for fashion workers in many ways. So yeah, it's a fascinating read. A lot of challenging topics like we've been talking about today, but everything from the horrible quality of arsenic dyes and the mercury for hat making. So these things are really important to talk about. And also from a conservation standpoint, we're now really careful with these objects in collections. Some of them have arsenic because arsenic was, very pervasively used as a way to perhaps prevent pests with natural history specimens and things like that. So feathered objects are still causing all sorts of problems.
There's another question here, and we had this conversation in our prep conversation. So one person asked, should we be concerned about the welfare of people who make feathers for today's crafting industry, thinking of feathers that are sold at Michael's and Hobby Lobby and Joann Fabrics?
Yeah, when I was doing some additional research to put tonight's presentation together, that came up a lot. Yeah, and it's a discussion that we have with our students, like, should Cardi B be walking the runway wearing feathers, because again, it's just like perpetuating the system, and everything that we see on the runway or the red carpet, trickles down, and then suddenly you kickstart a whole new interest in the wearing of feathers, which I think we have to think really, really carefully about it. I just don't really think that there is an ethical or sustainable way to incorporate feathers into fashion. I think so it's a real challenge. There's no really great way to make synthetic feathers either. The fur industry has benefited from polyesters and acrylics that can actually look really incredible, like real fur. They mimic it so perfectly, but there's not really anything. So I think what, some of the 3D printing labs that Iris van Herpen collaborates with are getting closer, or having a interesting time experimenting, but it's a real challenge. There's something magical about feathers that's just really difficult to recreate.
And like you mentioned earlier in your talk as well, a lot of those feathers that are sold in current stores are byproducts of the food industry. So not necessarily sustainable. I mean, I think better than the 1890s or 1900s. And of course, synthetics and polyesters and acrylics also have their own sustainability concerns and challenges with the plastic materials. One comment, not a question, but just a comment, and one person saying they're amazed that the feathers have not disintegrated over the years in storage. And I think that speaks to the care that a lot of families took in preserving their artifacts and that museums take. But I think it also speaks to the number of chemicals that went into preserving and prepping the feathers to be used. I think that was part of the industry, was making sure that they, making them more than a natural product, that they wouldn't break down, that they would be whole. And one of the things that I found, I couldn't really get a great image of this, but in storage, I was astonished to find 4 boxes of feathers, just feathers, not feathered hats, just tons of feathers. And they were all sorted by color. I think there was 1 box of white, a box of black, a box of mostly purples and mauves, and then kind of greens and yellows in the last box. And they were mostly ostrich plumes, like a really silky, fine feather. And it looked like they were, the majority of them are from, it seemed like the same species, but there's a huge cataloging project ahead of me at some point, I think. And it was just mind-blowing to think of the quantity of feathers kind of used in the marchand de mode 18th century way of, I want purple feathers in my hat today, and tomorrow maybe it's yellow and green, and how they could have been swapped. And the fact that, the Frick family, for members who are on here, the Frick family saved everything, but boxes of feathers was new to me for sure. Checking one more, we got one more comment. Saying, I know a local bird rehabilitator who saves feathers to send to a Native American feather bank for use in tribal traditions. The Native American people have special permission to possess the feathers.
Yeah, that's really important to think about too. I was talking with several of my students who are Native American. We had this really interesting conversation too, because they were telling me about the golden eagle feathers and war bonnets. And, they were saying that those objects belong to the culture, not individuals, and that they're something that, was meant to be passed down from generation to generation. So that idea of sustainability, like in somebody's lifetime, like one chief might only add 1 or 2 feathers. So that was really an interesting conversation to have with them, and something to think about. It's, it's outside of the fashion system, and, it's something that is, meant to have longevity.
Well, this was so much fun. It was such a great topic, and it's really wonderful to have you. It's such a dive into not just the 19th century, but kind of the history and into where feathers are going today. So thank you so much, Rebecca, for being here. And thank you everyone for joining tonight.
Thank you. I cannot wait, Rebecca, until you can come and visit us again and work with our collection and be in person. We will do it another time, but it is wonderful to have you on screen. I won't keep everybody too long. I just wanted to say a couple of things in wrap up. We will send a follow-up email to everybody who joined us tonight. Rebecca mentioned a lot of good resources. I will add another. Melanie Lynn Gutowski, who answered a couple of questions for us tonight, is one of our Clayton docents. She's a talented writer and bird lover, and it is actually due to her that we're doing this series of bird programs. She brought the topic up, and we have had a lot of fun exploring things related to our site. If you haven't been to the Frick, we have 5.5 outdoor acres for a beautiful park-like setting with a lot of birds that visit us every day. So we've been talking about birds outside, birds in the collection. Melanie wrote a wonderful blog post. The title is Crimes of Fashion, Gilded Age Millinery and the Plight of Birds, which gets at some of the many themes we talked about tonight. If you go to our Frick website, you can find the upper left corner, it says blog. If you click on that, hers is the first one you'll see, but I can send that out as well. And I just want to share my screen for 1 second and tell you about our next program, which is the third and last for now. Can you see that? Is that coming up, the slide? So we have three programs in this bird series. We'll do more someday, but for now, this will wrap up in April. Monday, April 12th, we have Kirk Wallace Johnson, who is the author of The Feather Thief, joining us live for a conversation about this book. He is lovely. I am so excited that we're bringing him in. It is the magic of Zoom. He lives, I think, in California and does not have to travel to Pittsburgh, like Rebecca does not have to travel to Pittsburgh. But this is a wonderful book. If you haven't read this, it's terrific. It gets at a lot of the issues that we talked about tonight. It goes into great detail about sort of the history of gathering feathers, collecting feathers, what's happened to birds over time, and then really delves into this incredible heist of hundreds of feathers by one young man, really, out of this British museum. So it's a wonderful book if you haven't read it. Mr. Johnson will be talking live with us. We are selling this book in our museum store. I know you can find things cheaper elsewhere, but I will say that it absolutely supports our museum if you shop with us. We have an online website, and if you do go there, I have to tell you that if you go to our store and then you click on spring online, we have some wonderful bird related merchandise, really, really cute things that if you're in the bird spring mood, you can join us for that. So I will include a link to register for this program in my email as well. I will end by saying thank you to Dawn, to Rebecca, to all of you for giving us your night, and also wrap up with an invitation if you are in the city physically near us, come to Pittsburgh and visit us at the Frick Pittsburgh. The grounds are free, they are open. In a couple of weeks, we will have daffodils all over the place. The crocus are coming up and you can see birds everywhere. So let's keep the springtime thoughts going, and hopefully we will see you for our next program in April. And thank you again, Dawn and Rebecca, so very much. It's a wonderful night. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Great.
Thank you, everyone.
So much. Have a great night.
Thank you so much. Good night, everyone.